Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst, or perhaps just gently drifting, into the surprisingly simple origin of library hush. Picture this: you're in a vast, echoing hall, sunlight slanting through high windows, the air thick with the scent of old papyrus and noise. Lots of it. Not the jarring clang of modern city life, but a persistent rolling hum of human voices. This isn't a marketplace, it's an ancient library. And it's absolutely not the silent sanctuary you're probably imagining. You're about to embark on a journey so mind-numbingly placid, so wonderfully uneventful, that, well, you probably won't survive this awake. And that's the whole point, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It actually helps the channel quite a bit. And hey, while you're at it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? It's always nice to see where everyone is drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing not on plush, sound-dampening carpet, but on cool stone floors. Perhaps in the legendary Library of Alexandria? Or maybe the rival institution at Pergamum. Forget those neat rows of perfectly bound books you're used to. Instead, surrounding you are countless alcoves, niches, and shelves, absolutely crammed with scrolls, papyrus mostly, some parchment. These aren't the slim, easily digestible paperbacks of today. Each scroll is a rolled-up length of processed reed or animal skin, often heavy, sometimes quite long, and utterly, magnificently, devoid of helpful modern conventions. Imagine unrolling one. There are no page numbers, no chapters clearly demarcated, and most importantly, no spaces between the words. It's just a continuous, unbroken stream of letters, a scriptura continua, as scholars call it. Punctuation, a luxury for a far distant future. Maybe a dot here or there if the scribe was feeling generous, but don't count on it. Now, try reading that silently in your head. Tricky. Isn't it your brain struggles to parse where one word ends and another begins? It's like looking at a string of computer code if you've never coded, just a jumble. This is precisely why these ancient libraries were far from silent. Reading, for most people and for most purposes, was an oral activity. You had to sound out the words, often quite loudly, to make sense of the text. It was less about internal contemplation and more about auditory processing. You'd see scholars, students, and philosophers scattered around, some in small groups, others on their own, but almost all of them murmuring, chanting, or even full-on declaiming the text they were studying. The very act of reading was a vocal performance, a way to wrestle meaning from the dense script. The Great Library of Alexandria, for instance, wasn't just a repository of scrolls. It was a vibrant research institution, the Mouseion, or Shrine of the Muses. It buzzed with intellectual life. Scholars from across the known world gathered here. They didn't just sit and read quietly, they debated, they lectured, they collaborated. Imagine trying to conduct a lively philosophical debate with your colleague about the nature of the cosmos while also trying to maintain a pin-drop silence. It just wouldn't compute. The air would be thick with arguments, discussions, and the sounds of various languages as texts from different cultures were consulted and translated. Think of it less as a hushed cathedral of books and more as a bustling university campus, complete with lecture halls, meeting rooms, and even communal dining areas. A mainstream historical fact is that the Library of Alexandria was indeed a pioneering research institute, hosting famous thinkers like Euclid and Eratosthenes, who certainly weren't just sitting in quiet corners. Now, you might wonder if everyone just shouted over each other. Perhaps not always. There were likely designated spaces for different activities. Maybe a quieter alcove for intense private study still read aloud, just more softly. and larger halls for more boisterous discussions or formal readings. Sometimes a wealthy individual might have a lector, a skilled slave or paid reader, to read texts aloud to them. You could recline on your couch, close your eyes, and have Homer's epic verses or a new philosophical treatise literally poured into your ears. It's a bit like having a personal live-action audiobook, though probably with fewer options for adjusting the playback speed. Can you imagine complaining that your lector's accent was a bit much for Herodotus? Honestly, Demetrios, your Scythian accent sounds suspiciously like your Theban one. Are you even trying? There's a quirky little tidbit to consider. Some ancient readers might have developed highly stylized ways of vocalizing texts. Different genres could have had their own traditional cadences or melodic patterns. A tragedy might be read with a mournful, rhythmic chant, while a historical account could be delivered in a more straightforward, declarative tone. It adds another layer to the soundscape, doesn't it? Not just a drone of voices, but a varied tapestry of intonations and rhythms, almost like a subtle, unorganized form of music. Historians still argue whether the primary method of engaging with texts in these grand ancient libraries was predominantly individual oral reading, where each person murmured their own scroll, or if it leaned more towards performative, group-based recitations where one person might read to several others. Perhaps it was a lively mix of both, depending on the text, the setting, and the specific scholarly pursuit. The idea of silent reading as a common skill was centuries away. If someone could read silently without moving their lips or making a sound, it was considered quite remarkable, almost a party trick. St. Augustine, writing in the late 4th century AD, famously commented on St. Ambrose's unusual ability to read silently, noting it with a sense of wonder. This tells you just how ingrained the oral tradition of reading was. So, the library you're currently wandering through is alive with the human voice. It's a place where knowledge isn't just passively absorbed from a silent page, but is actively spoken, heard, and debated into existence. Forget the stereotype of the bespectacled librarian fiercely guarding the silence with a menacing shh. That guardian of quietude simply wouldn't have a place here. In fact, they'd probably be thoroughly perplexed by the very concept. If anything, they might encourage you to speak up a bit if your murmuring was too faint to make out the true beauty of the poetry you were wrestling with. The only real noise complaint might be if your chariot clattered too loudly on the paving stones outside. The sound of intellectual pursuit that was music to their ancient ears. So, you leave behind the relatively refined, if still vociferous, atmosphere of Alexandria, with its vast collections of papyrus, and you travel further back, much further back, into the mists of time. Your sandals kick up a fine, pale dust as you find yourself in the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, perhaps in the bustling city of Ur or the learned centers of Babylon. The air here is different, drier, with an earthy tang of damp clay and the faint, slightly acrid scent of reeds from the riverbanks. Instead of scrolls, your eyes are met with an astonishing sight rooms, entire buildings, filled with heavy, rectilinear clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, ranging from the size of your palm to hefty slabs that would take 2 hands to lift, all covered in intricate wedge-shaped marks. This is the world of cuneiform, one of humanity's earliest forms of writing, and the libraries and archives here are, if anything, even more resonant with sound than their later Hellenistic counterparts. You're now in what might be an idubba, a tablet house, which served as both a scribal school and an archive. Don't picture hushed rows of diligent students silently copying texts. Oh no. Picture a room, perhaps a courtyard open to the sky in its center, filled with young apprentices and seasoned scribes, all deeply engrossed in the laborious process of learning and working with clay. You hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of styluses, sharpened reeds or bone, being pressed into wet clay. You see boys, and occasionally girls, hunched over their practice tablets, their lips moving, their voices a constant, low hum as they sound out the syllables. Learning cuneiform was an arduous task. This script wasn't a simple alphabet. It contained hundreds of signs, many of which could represent multiple syllables or entire words. Polyphony. And just to keep things interesting, multiple signs could represent the same sound homophony. Mastering it took years. A mainstream historical fact being that Mesopotamian scribes underwent rigorous, often grueling training for up to 12 years to achieve full literacy and proficiency in the diverse range of texts they needed to handle. From epic poems and religious hymns to complex administrative ledgers and astronomical calculations. Imagine these students, day in and day out, copying lists of signs, vocabulary lists, proverbs, and short literary passages. Their teachers would dictate and they would transcribe, their young voices rising and falling as they repeated the words, trying to hammer the complex forms and sounds into their memories. It was learning by rote, by repetition, by vocalization. You'd hear them chanting in unison, a chorus of Sumerian or Akkadian syllables filling the air. If a student made a mistake, the teacher, the ummiyah, or expert, might correct them, perhaps sharply, adding another layer to the room's soundscape. The very process of inscribing a tablet often involved vocalization. A scribe dictating a letter or a legal document to an assistant would speak the words aloud. The assistant, while pressing the stylus into the clay, might murmur the words back to ensure accuracy. Once a tablet was complete, especially an important one, it would often be read aloud again to check for errors. Think of it as a very early form of proofreading, but entirely auditory. You couldn't just quickly scan for typos with your eyes. You had to hear if the text flowed correctly, if the right words and formulas had been used. Trying to find a specific piece of information. Good luck with that Ctrl plus Eve impulse. Right. I need the trade figures for Dillman from 3 harvests ago. Looks like I'll be listening to Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada from the beginning again, just to be safe. The administrative function of these clay tablet archives also necessitated oral performance. Laws, royal edicts, and public announcements inscribed on large tablets or stelae would be read aloud in public squares or at city gates by heralds or scribes. This was how information was disseminated to a largely illiterate populace. The tablet, in this sense, was often just a prompt for a vocal proclamation, the definitive record that backed up the spoken word. Contracts would be read aloud to all parties involved before witnesses pressed their cylinder seals into the clay, ensuring everyone understood the terms, or at least heard them. There was no hiding in the fine print when the print itself was being belted out by a man with a strong voice. Here's a quirky little tidbit that brings these ancient scribes to life. Archaeologists have unearthed many practice tablets from these adubas, and some bear not just neat rows of cuneiform, but also the very human traces of student life. You find tablets with frustrated doodles in the margins, others where a student has clearly messed up and tried to smooth over the clay, and even some with complaints about the difficulty of the lessons or the strictness of the teachers. One can almost imagine a young scribe, after a particularly challenging day of chanting obscure Sumerian verb forms, idly scratching a caricature of his stern ummiyah, or perhaps a little drawing of a gazelle, dreaming of being anywhere but in that noisy, dusty room. Maybe one of them even inscribed a tiny plea, "May Adad strike my classmate Enlil Bani dumb, for he chants his omens far too loudly next to my good ear." An ancient, accidental plea for quiet. The sounds of the aduba weren't just human voices and tapping styluses. There was the squelch of wet clay being kneaded, the occasional thud as a tablet was dropped, a truly disastrous event. Imagine your entire term paper, painstakingly inscribed, shattering into a dozen pieces, and the general hubbub of a busy working environment. These were not serene cloisters. They were workshops of words, and words in this era had to be given voice to be fully realized. Historians still argue whether the silent perusal of cuneiform for simple data extraction, like a seasoned scribe quickly checking a number in a familiar ledger or a list of goods, was truly silent, or if even that highly specialized act involved a sub-vocalized muttering or internal sounding out, a deeply ingrained habit from years of oral training. Given the script's complexity, It's hard to imagine it being as visually intuitive as modern alphabetic scripts are for us. So, as you stand amidst these Mesopotamian scribes, surrounded by the tangible weight of their clay records and the inescapable chorus of their work, you realize that the concept of a silent library, a quiet archive, is an anachronism here. Knowledge was vocal, learning was vocal, administration was vocal. The act of writing itself was often an accompaniment to speech, and reading was almost invariably a performance, whether for oneself, for a teacher, or for the public. The idea of retreating into the quiet to consult a text would have seemed utterly bizarre. The text only truly came alive when it was spoken. The original form of autocorrect, by the way, wasn't a helpful red squiggle. It was more likely the head scribe noticing your fumbling pronunciation during a readback and giving you a sharp tap with a reed to encourage, shall we say, greater accuracy next time. These were loud, vibrant, and intensely human spaces, where the very air vibrated with the effort of pinning down language onto clay, leaving the dusty, sun-baked clamor of Mesopotamian tablet houses far behind. You feel the centuries peel away like layers of an ancient onion, which, come to think of it, probably also featured heavily in the Mesopotamian diet. You find yourself now drifting into a different era, a different climate. The air grows cooler, damper. You're in early medieval Europe, perhaps in a stone-built monastery nestled in a remote Irish valley, or a burgeoning Benedictine abbey in Italy. The grand, public-facing libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum are distant memories, many of their contents lost or scattered. With the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, the flame of scholarship, of preserving texts, flickered and was carefully, painstakingly, cupped in the hands of monastic orders. You step into the scriptorium, the dedicated room for copying texts. It's not silent. Not yet. Not in the way you might imagine a modern library. But the quality of sound is distinctly different from the boisterous Aduba or the argumentative halls of Alexandria. Gone is the constant, loud declaiming, the overt group chanting of lessons. Instead, you might hear a low, collective murmur, a soft susurrus of voices. The primary activity here is copying, and it's incredibly demanding work. Monks, their forms often hunched against the chill that even thick stone walls can't entirely dispel, are bent over wooden desks. The primary sounds are the rhythmic, almost hypnotic, scratching of quill pens on parchment or vellum, the occasional rustle of a large manuscript page being turned, perhaps the distant sound of plainsong drifting in from the chapel. The scent is of ink, often made from oak galls and iron salts, a sharp, metallic tang, mixed with the animal scent of the parchment itself, and maybe the sweet aroma of beeswax from candles. If the light is poor, the guiding principle of many monastic orders, like the Benedictines, was ora et labora, pray and work. And for many monks, the labora was this meticulous, sacred act of copying. They were transcribing the Bible, the writings of church fathers, and, crucially for us, the surviving works of classical authors, thus preserving them through centuries of upheaval. This was not just a job, it was a spiritual devotion, an act of worship. A mainstream historical fact is that these monastic scriptoria, particularly those following the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasized manual labor and study, became the powerhouses of textual preservation and transmission throughout the early and high Middle Ages. Without them, a vast swath of ancient knowledge might simply have vanished. Now, the rule of St. Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guidelines, emphasized order, diligence, and the avoidance of idle talk. It didn't necessarily impose a vow of absolute tomb-like silence on the scriptorium from the get-go. Monks still needed to consult with each other, perhaps to clarify a difficult passage in the exemplar, the master copy they were working from, or to request supplies like more ink or a newly sharpened quill. And the act of reading itself, especially with manuscripts that still often lacked clear word separation or consistent punctuation, often involved a soft muttering, a mumbling aloud known as murmuratio or ruminatio. This quiet vocalization was an aid to comprehension and memorization, a way to process the text almost physically, to chew it over, as the term ruminatio, like a cow chewing its cud, suggests. So the scriptorium wasn't a free-for-all chatterfest, but neither was it a vacuum of sound. It was a workspace, and some functional noise was inevitable. If Brother Gregory needed to ask Brother Michael if the Latin word obfuscate really had three F's or if the exemplar scribe was just having a laugh, he'd probably do so in a low tone. However, the ideal was shifting. The very nature of the work, hours upon hours of focused, individual effort, requiring immense concentration to avoid errors that could corrupt a sacred text, naturally fostered an appreciation for a quieter environment. Distractions were costly, not just in terms of wasted parchment and expensive commodity, made from painstakingly prepared animal skins, but also in terms of potential theological misinterpretations. Imagine the horror. Oops. I just spent 6 hours meticulously copying the wrong verse because Brother Cuthbert was humming his favorite Gregorian chant. Slightly off key next to me. Now the book of Revelation has an extra, very confusing horseman whose primary attribute seems to be an unhealthy obsession with artisanal cheese. The pressure was on to get it right. This brings us to a rather charming, quirky tidbit as the desire for less vocal disruption grew. Some monastic orders developed surprisingly elaborate systems of sign language for use in the scriptorium, and sometimes in other parts of the monastery where silence was enjoined. Like the refectory during meals, instead of asking aloud for a book, a monk might make a gesture mimicking the turning of pages. Need more ink? A specific hand signal. Want your quill sharpened? Another gesture. There were even signs for specific types of books or authors. For example, to indicate a pagan author, a monk might make the sign for book and then scratch his ear like a dog, an allusion to the perceived unclean or base nature of the pre-Christian writer, whose work was nevertheless being copied. Perhaps with a silent prayer for their soul, or at least a mental note to be extra careful with the content. It's a fascinating intersection of necessity and devotion, creating a whole silent vocabulary to navigate the workday. One can only imagine the passive-aggressive sign language that might have developed if someone was, say, scraping their parchment too vigorously to smooth it for writing perhaps a series of exaggerated winces, followed by the sign for demon and loud noise. Historians still argue whether the growing injunctions towards quiet work and even periods of mandated silence in early and later monastic scriptoria were primarily driven by the need to foster spiritual contemplation and a prayerful atmosphere, or if they stemmed more from purely pragmatic reasons, the need for accuracy, the prevention of costly errors, and the simple efficiency of minimizing distractions in a complex, manual, and often communal task. It was likely a bit of both, the spiritual and the practical reinforcing each other. A quiet space allowed the monk to focus his mind on God while meticulously forming his letters. And it also helped ensure that the apocalypse didn't accidentally gain that cheese-loving fifth horseman. The fear of error was profound. Consider the common medieval illustration of the demon Titavilus, who was said to collect the dropped syllables and miscopied words of scribes in a sack to be used against them on Judgment Day. No pressure, right? The fear of a simple sneeze, and when your quill is laden with that precious, dark ink, hovering over a near-perfect page of vellum that took the skin of an entire calf to produce, must have been immense. One sudden achoo, and you've not just ruined hours of work, you've potentially created an abstract art masterpiece that your abbot will not appreciate in the middle of the Psalms. So you can see how, gradually, the emphasis on quiet, on stillness, on minimizing any potential disruption would naturally grow. The scriptorium was becoming a crucible where the value of silence for focused, detailed work was being forged, not by grand decree initially, but by the very nature of the tasks at hand and the spiritual aspirations of the workers. The seeds of our modern library hush were being sown, not in grand public halls, but in these dedicated, increasingly quiet, monastic workshops of the word. So, you're drifting away from those monastic scriptoria, where the gentle scratching of quills and the low murmur of ruminatio created a focused, if not entirely silent, soundscape. The monks, with their painstaking labor and developing sign language. Remember those subtle gestures for pagan author, handle with care, possibly with tongs? We're already tilling the soil for a quieter world of words. But a truly profound shift, a genuine revolution in how human beings interacted with written texts, was slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, beginning to take root. This was the rise of silent reading, and it would change everything, including the potential decibel level of your local library. For centuries, as you've heard, reading was almost exclusively an oral affair. From the booming pronouncements over clay tablets in Mesopotamia, to the scholarly discussions echoing through the halls of Alexandria, to even the careful, soft vocalizations of monks in their scriptoria, the voice was an indispensable tool for unlocking meaning from script. You'll recall St. Augustine's account from the 4th century AD when he observed Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, reading silently. Augustine noted it with such distinct surprise. His eyes scanned the page and his heart sought out the meaning, but his voice was silent and his tongue was still. That it underscores just how exceptional this practice was. For most people, the idea of reading without moving your lips or making a sound would have been as odd as trying to taste food without putting it in your mouth. It just wasn't how it was done. Ambrose was, in this respect, a man ahead of his time, a sort of cognitive pioneer. What made silent reading so revolutionary? Well, it fundamentally altered the relationship between the reader, the text, and the surrounding world. When you read aloud, the text becomes a semi-public event. Even if you're only murmuring to yourself, as your interpretation, your pacing, your points of hesitation are, to some extent, audible. But silent reading, that's an entirely private conversation between you and the page. Your thoughts can wander, question, and connect in ways that are unconstrained by the need to vocalize. It allows for a different kind of immersion, a deeper, more personal dive into the world of the text, and perhaps most practically, it's generally much faster. You can absorb information at the speed of thought, not the speed of speech. Imagine the first person who truly mastered this. Their friends are all still on page 3 of some dense theological argument, sounding out every syllable like it's a tongue twister. And this silent reading prodigy is already halfway through the book, nodding sagely. Oh, the bit about the dialectical synthesis of virtue? Yeah, fascinating stuff. Took a different turn than I expected around chapter 7. They must have seemed like they possessed some kind of literary superpower. This cognitive leap didn't happen in a vacuum. It was aided, significantly, by gradual but crucial changes in the way manuscripts themselves were written. Remember those unbroken streams of letters? The scriptura continua you encountered in ancient scrolls. Trying to read that silently is like trying to find a specific fish in a murky, fast-flowing river. But over time, particularly from around the 7th and 8th centuries onwards, those wonderful Irish and Scottish monks, working away in their remote island scriptoria, probably needing something to keep their minds occupied during all that rain, began to popularize the practice of separating words with spaces. This might seem like a ridiculously simple innovation to us, like inventing sliced bread, only for words, but it was a game changer. A mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of word separation in Latin texts, and subsequently in vernacular languages, dramatically improved the legibility of manuscripts and was a key enabler for the spread of silent reading. Suddenly, text became much easier to parse visually. Punctuation, too, though still far from standardized, began to appear more regularly, offering further visual cues to sentence structure and meaning. The page started to speak more directly to the eye, lessening the reliance on the ear. The implications were vast. With silent reading, Scholarship could become a more individual, contemplative pursuit. You could sit with a text, wrestle with its ideas in the privacy of your own mind, and form your own interpretations without the immediate feedback or influence of a listening audience. This perhaps even allowed for more daring or unorthodox thoughts to be entertained. As they weren't being road tested aloud in real time, the speed advantage also meant that a scholar could potentially engage with a far greater volume of material. The very pace of intellectual life could begin to quicken. Of course, early attempts at silent reading might have been a bit leaky. Imagine someone concentrating fiercely, determined to read without a sound, but little whispers keep escaping. No, no, I'm being silent. Psst. Constantinople. Drat. Heresy. It's a learned skill, and like any skill, it takes practice. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. The rise of silent reading might have initially been met with a degree of suspicion, or even anxiety in some quarters. In a world where reading was a communal, oral activity, someone sitting quietly with a book, their thoughts unvoiced, could seem a bit shifty. What were they really thinking? Were they truly understanding the text if they weren't sounding it out, processing it in the traditionally accepted way? Were they having private, perhaps even subversive, ideas prompted by the words on the page? Ideas that weren't being aired and moderated by the community's ears? It's a bit like how people first reacted to seeing others wearing headphones, completely absorbed in their own personal soundscape, seemingly detached from their immediate surroundings. There can be a subtle distrust of the intensely private engagement. The relief, though, when word separation became more common, must have been palpable for those learning to read. Oh, so that's what that dense clump of letters was trying to say. I've been accidentally invoking the spirit of a long-dead Visigothic tax collector for the past 3 pages, thinking it was just a very complex sentence about agricultural yields. The clarity offered by spaces between words is something we take utterly for granted, like the air we breathe. But for the medieval reader, it was a significant technological upgrade for the brain, making the path to silent comprehension much smoother. Historians still argue whether the rise and spread of silent reading directly and immediately led to an increased demand for quieter library-like spaces, or if both phenomena were somewhat parallel developments, both spurred on by broader shifts in intellectual culture, the increasing value placed on individual contemplation, and the changing nature of scholarly work. It's likely a bit of a chicken and egg situation, or perhaps more accurately, a slowly co-evolving dance. As more people became capable of, and preferred, silent reading, the ambient noise of collective oral reading would naturally begin to subside in places of study. And as spaces became quieter, it would, in turn, make silent reading an easier and more attractive option. This new mode of engaging with text was nothing short of revolutionary. It empowered the individual reader, privatized the act of interpretation to a degree, and fundamentally changed the intellectual landscape. It was a crucial step, a foundational prerequisite, for the kind of silent libraries we envision today. Without the ability to read silently, the demand for silence itself would simply not have the same urgency. The quiet revolution was happening, one silent page turn at a time. So, you've witnessed this incredible internal revolution, this newfound ability for people to read silently, to have that private conversation with a text without needing to sound it out like a town crier announcing a lost goat. Remember Ambrose impressing Augustine with his quiet page scanning. This skill is slowly spreading, empowering individual readers and changing the very texture of intellectual engagement. But the journey towards hushed libraries isn't just about what's happening inside people's heads. It's also about the physical realities of how books were kept and accessed. And for that, you need to brace yourself for a bit of hardware. You find yourself stepping into what looks like a medieval or early Renaissance library, perhaps attached to a university or a cathedral. The light is probably a bit dim, filtering through narrow, possibly stained glass windows. The air is cool, carrying the scent of aged wood, old leather, and something faintly metallic. And then you see them books, not neatly arranged on open shelves for you to casually browse, but physically tethered, each one bound to its place with a chain. This, my friend, is a chained library, rows of lecterns, or sloping shelves. Hold these precious volumes, and from the cover or spine of each book, a metal chain, usually iron or brass, extends to a rod running along the shelf or desk. It's quite the sight. You can take a book down, place it on the lectern before you, and read it, but try to walk away with it, not a chance. That chain will stop you with a very definite clink and a jolt. Now, the primary overwhelming reason for this rather robust security measure was, as you might guess, to prevent theft. In an age before mass printing had truly taken off, and even well into the era of early printed books, each volume, especially a handwritten manuscript, was an object of immense value. Creating one took hundreds, sometimes thousands, of hours of skilled labor, from preparing the parchment or vellum, remember those poor calves, to meticulously copying the text, to illuminating it with vibrant, often gold-leafed illustrations, and finally binding it. A single book could be worth as much as a small farm or a house. Losing one was a significant blow, not just financially, but also in terms of access to knowledge. So, chaining them up was the medieval equivalent of a very serious security system. Think of it as the original anti-theft tag, just a tad more assertive. You can check this book out anytime you like, but it can literally never leave. This very specific 3-foot radius of its designated lectern. A mainstream historical fact is that chained libraries were a common feature across Europe from the Middle Ages, right up until the 18th century in some places. You'd find them in monastic libraries, cathedral libraries, and especially in early university libraries where collections were growing and the readership, while scholarly, perhaps couldn't always be trusted not to be forgetful. Hereford Cathedral in England still has a fully functional chained library, a wonderfully preserved example that you can visit today, and it really gives you a sense of this different way of interacting with books. But here's where it connects to our story of evolving quiet. While the chains were there for security, they had an unintended yet significant side effect. They encouraged stillness. And stillness, as you can imagine, is a close cousin of quiet. If you're reading a chained book, you are, by necessity, stationary. You can't wander off to a more comfortable chair or pace around while you ponder a difficult passage. You're anchored. This drastically reduced the amount of movement, the general rustling and shuffling that you might find in a space where people are freely fetching and carrying books. Fewer people moving means fewer accidental bumps, fewer dropped items, fewer whispered conversations as people pass each other in the aisles. The entire physical dynamic of the room becomes more static, more settled. It doesn't enforce vocal silence, not directly, but it subtly nudges the overall atmosphere towards a less boisterous state. Reading becomes, by default, a more fixed and focused activity. Imagine the scene scholars or students, each at their assigned lectern, tethered to their chosen text. They might still be muttering softly if they haven't quite mastered that silent reading trick you learned about in the last section, or if the script is particularly challenging. But the overall level of physical activity is low. There's a certain gravity to the room, imposed by these metal tethers. It's a bit like everyone being in their own little, slightly restrictive reading cubicle, long before actual cubicles were invented. The clinking of a chain as someone adjusted a heavy volume, or the scrape of a wooden stool might be the loudest sounds. It's not the hush of a modern research library, but it's a step away from the more dynamic, conversational environments of ancient libraries. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Sometimes those chains were, shall we say, not optimally designed for reader comfort or collaborative work. They might be just long enough to allow you to read, but not quite long enough to lean back comfortably, or to easily compare two texts side by side if they were chained a little too far apart. You can almost hear the grumbles. "Brother Anselm, your chain is dangling directly across my illumination of St. George. And could you please stop fidgeting every time you adjust your Aquinas? My Plato does a little jig." The logistics of navigating a shared space with multiple chained books must have required a certain amount of patience and spatial awareness. Excuse me, pardon me, just trying to get to the canon law section. Mind your chain, Brother Gilbert. Historians still argue whether the undeniable psychological effect of being physically tethered to a book and its designated reading station contributed significantly to a more subdued, perhaps even a more respectful or reverent atmosphere within these libraries. Quite apart from the simple reduction in physical movement and ambient noise, did being literally bound to the source of knowledge make one approach it with a more solemn demeanor? It's an interesting thought. Perhaps the sheer physicality of the arrangement reminded users of the value and gravitas of the text they were consulting. The daily routine of a librarian in such a place might have included not just cataloging and acquiring books, but also literally oiling the chains to prevent them from rusting or squeaking too much. Can't have a cacophony of corroded Cicero, can we? It distracts the theologians from their disputations on the nature of angels. And imagine the poor reader who finds the one crucial text they need is at the very end of a long lectern, already occupied by several other large tomes. And the chain is just tantalizingly too short for them to read it without adopting a posture that would make a contortionist proud. Almost got the consolation of philosophy? Nope. My left kidney has just lodged a formal protest. Oh, we worry about our phone batteries dying. They worried about acute spinal compression from trying to read Boethius at a 45-degree angle. So, while the chains were primarily about keeping the books from walking away, they inadvertently created an environment that was more conducive to quiet, focused study. If you're fixed in place, and you're increasingly able to read silently thanks to those clever monks and their word-spacing wizardry. Remember, the stage is being progressively set. The chains didn't demand silence, but they certainly didn't encourage a barn dance. They fostered a stillness, a lack of random perambulation that naturally lowered the ambient sound levels, making those increasingly common silent readers feel a little more at home. All right, so you felt the cool metal of those book chains? A very tangible reminder of how precious and vulnerable knowledge was, and how that system, while designed for security, also kind of pinned readers into a state of stillness. Remember Brother Anselm getting his chain in Brother Timothy's Augustine Good Times? Now, let's take that developing ability to read silently, and that enforced stillness, and see how it plays out as you wander into the burgeoning world of medieval universities. You're now treading the ancient cobblestones of Bologna, or perhaps navigating the narrow lanes leading to the Sorbonne in Paris. Or maybe finding your way to one of the early colleges in Oxford or Cambridge. These are the new powerhouses of intellectual life, drawing students and masters from all over Christendom. Step inside the library of one of these early universities. What do you find? Well, it's probably not a vast, cathedral-like space, at least not in the earliest period. University libraries often started as relatively modest collections, sometimes just a room or a few chests of books. And yes, those books are very likely still chained. The students, often young and perhaps a bit boisterous, couldn't always be trusted with such valuable resources. The chains you saw earlier, they are definitely here, keeping the precious works of Aristotle, Galen, and Aquinas tethered to their lecterns. This meant readers were still quite stationary, which, as we know, helps keep the general shuffling to a minimum. But the soundscape, it's probably a lot more dynamic than the quietest monastic scriptorium. A medieval university was a hive of intellectual activity, and much of that activity was intensely oral. The core of the curriculum was scholasticism, a method of learning that emphasized dialectical reasoning. This meant rigorous debate, the presentation of arguments and counter-arguments, and public disputations. A mainstream historical fact is that early university education relied heavily on these oral methods. Masters would deliver lectures, which often involved them reading aloud from a core text, say a work by Aristotle, and then providing extensive commentary. Their own lectio. Students were expected to listen, take notes if they could afford the materials, and, crucially, to engage. They would practice their arguments, discuss texts with each other, and prepare for those all-important disputations where they would have to publicly defend a thesis. So, you can imagine the library, or spaces adjacent to it, buzzing with this kind of vocal intellectual energy. Students might be huddled together, reading a difficult passage aloud, trying to decipher its meaning collectively. You'd hear the drone of someone practicing their Latin rhetoric, trying to get the inflections just right for their upcoming debate. Therefore, I posit with utmost conviction. No, wait. Therefore, I posit it's the medieval equivalent of a study group, but with a much greater emphasis on spoken recitation because many were still sounding out text for comprehension, especially complex philosophical or legal arguments. The very air would be thick with logic, theology, and the sounds of young scholars wrestling with big ideas, often quite vocally. Imagine trying to get your head around Peter Lombard's sentences while the chap at the next lectern is passionately and loudly rehearsing his arguments on the nature of universals. Your point about nominalism is intriguing. Nigel, but could you perhaps nominalize a bit more softly? I'm trying to have an existential crisis with Augustine over here. However, amidst this general scholarly hubbub, the seeds of change, those quiet little revolutions you've been tracking, are still sprouting. That ability to read silently is becoming more widespread, especially among more advanced scholars and masters. And as silent reading proficiency grows, so does the desire for environments where one can actually do it without a barrage of external noise. If you're capable of diving deep into a text in the privacy of your own mind, the constant oral rehearsal of your peers can become a significant distraction, not an aid. This is where you start to see the very first tentative buds of what we might call quiet zones. It wouldn't have been a sudden switch. No librarian putting up a "Silence Please" sign in elegant Gothic script. Rather, it would have been a more organic development. Perhaps a particular alcove, slightly removed from the main thoroughfare of the library, became known as the spot where the serious, silent readers congregated. Or maybe a small, separate room. If the institution was wealthy enough to have one, was informally claimed by those needing to escape the disputational din. The rise of individual study carrels, those little niche-like desks often built into window recesses, which began appearing in some monastic libraries and later in university settings, also points to this growing need for private, less disturbed workspace. Even if these carrels weren't fully enclosed or soundproof, they offered a degree of personal space and a psychological barrier against the surrounding activity. Now, for a quirky tidbit medieval university students, bless their enthusiastic hearts, were not always paragons of scholarly decorum. University records from the period are peppered with accounts of, shall we say, less than studious behavior. There are complaints about excessive noise, rowdiness, forbidden games like dice being played in or near scholarly precincts, and even the occasional illicit drinking session. One can only imagine the exasperation of a dedicated librarian or master upon discovering that the new commentary on Boethius was being used as a makeshift cheese board, or that a spirited game of knucklebones was taking place in the canon law section. For the last time, lads, the decretals of Gratian are not to be used as a backstop for your gambling habit. And keep your voices down. Some of us are trying to commune with Plato. Historians still argue whether the earliest quiet zones or moves towards noise reduction in university libraries were primarily a result of top-down regulations, masters and librarians trying to impose order on an unruly student body, or if they were more of a bottom-up phenomenon, driven by the demands of scholars themselves who were increasingly engaged in private. Silent reading and research and genuinely needed less distraction to do their work effectively. It was likely a combination of both the authorities wanting order and the serious students wanting an environment conducive to their evolving methods of study. The medieval university library, then, was a fascinatingly mixed environment. It was still, in many ways, a loud space, reflecting the oral traditions of teaching and learning. The buzz of debate and discussion was integral to its function, but the increasing prevalence of silent reading coupled with the sheer necessity for deep concentration required by advanced scholarship, meant that the desire for, and perhaps the gradual emergence of, quieter spaces was beginning to take hold. The chain still kept the book secure and the readers relatively fixed, but the intellectual and auditory landscape was subtly shifting. The idea that a library could be, and perhaps should be, a place of profound quiet was no longer entirely alien, even if it wasn't yet the dominant reality. The distant murmur of the modern hushed library was, if you listened very carefully, just beginning to make itself heard above the scholastic fray. You're now drifting away from those medieval university halls, where the echoes of scholastic debate and the occasional clatter of a dropped dice remember brother librarians' despair over the gambling in Aquinas, mingled with the rustle of chained pages. The ability to read silently is gaining traction. The desire for a bit of personal study space is emerging with those early carols, but the overall environment is still pretty lively. Now, however, you feel a tremor in the very fabric of how knowledge is created and shared. A new scent fills the air, not just old parchment and beeswax, but something sharper, more metallic. The smell of oil-based ink and the faint, pervasive scent of paper. Lots and lots of paper. You hear a new sound, a rhythmic, mechanical clanking and pressing, a sound that will change the world. You've arrived in the age of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, around the mid-15th century, perfects his system of movable type. And suddenly, the game is entirely different. Before this, every single book was a handcrafted, unique object, copied out letter by some diligent monk or scribe. Remember how valuable they were, worth a farm. Some of them now, with the printing press. Text can be reproduced in quantities previously unimaginable, and at a fraction of the cost and time. A mainstream historical fact is that the invention of the printing press led to an unprecedented explosion in the availability of books, fueling literacy, and becoming a pivotal engine for transformative movements like the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. Knowledge began to flow like never before. This wasn't just a quantitative change, it was qualitative too. Printed books were more uniform, while early printed books, or incunabula, often tried to mimic the look of manuscripts. They rapidly developed their own characteristics. Typefaces became more standardized. Page layouts, the use of punctuation, and eventually even things like title pages. Tables of contents and indexes became more consistent. All these features made texts significantly easier to read, especially silently. No more deciphering wildly idiosyncratic scribal handwriting or guessing where one word ended and another began, though early printers could still make a glorious mess of things. Mind you, the path for your eyes to glide across the page and your mind to absorb the meaning just got a whole lot smoother. So, how does this connect to our quest for quiet? It's largely an indirect yet profoundly powerful influence. With books becoming more affordable and accessible, more individuals could own them. Reading started to shift from being primarily an institutional or elite activity to something that could be done in the privacy of one's own home, by a merchant, an artisan, or a moderately well-off farmer. This privatization of reading is key. If you have your own copy of a book, you're more likely to engage with it on your own terms, at your own pace. And if you're reading for your own pleasure or edification, and you've mastered silent reading, which is now easier than ever thanks to clearer print, you naturally prefer an environment where you can concentrate. You want to enjoy your peaceful pages in peace. Libraries, of course, began to acquire these newfangled printed books, often in large numbers. Their collections swelled, and the people coming to use these libraries were increasingly readers who were accustomed to this more personal, silent mode of engagement. While the university disputations and oral traditions didn't vanish overnight, the sheer volume of available printed material tilted the balance. There was simply more to read than ever before, and silent reading was the most efficient way to get through it. The fellow who used to spend an hour loudly deciphering a single manuscript page with his study group could now potentially breeze through several chapters of a clearly printed book on his own in the same amount of time, provided he wasn't being deafened by someone else's declamations. The rise of printing also, rather amusingly, created a new set of anxieties and boasts. Scribes, whose work was so painstaking, would sometimes include a colophon at the end of a manuscript, perhaps noting who commissioned it, who wrote it, and often a plea for the reader to pray for their soul or to forgive any errors. Early printers developed their own versions. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some printers' marks or colophons in early printed books almost read like advertisements, occasionally boasting about the speed of production or the accuracy of their edition, a stark contrast to the humble or sometimes grumpy notes of scribes. You might find a printer proudly proclaiming their work was diligently corrected and printed with great dispatch, perhaps with a subtle dig at the perceived slowness and error-proneness of handwritten copies. Get your epistles of Cicero here, folks fresh off the press. Guaranteed fewer scribal blunders than that old parchment thing your grandpa reads. Small print apprentice may have inverted a few paragraphs on page 73, our apologies. He was thinking about lunch. The scribes themselves must have looked at these new machines with a mixture of awe and terror. Well, there goes the neighborhood, one might have grumbled to another, flexing his cramped fingers. And my meticulously honed skill in uncial script. But on the bright side, my carpal tunnel can finally apply for early retirement. The sheer speed was astonishing. What took a monk months, a press could churn out in days. Historians still argue whether the initial impact of the printing press on the actual atmosphere within existing libraries was more towards creating busier, perhaps even noisier, spaces due to the sudden influx of new material and potentially more users, or if the concurrent and now accelerated rise in silent reading habits immediately began to exert a stronger, more palpable pressure for quiet. It was probably a bit of a transitional muddle for a while. Imagine a library trying to accommodate both the old-style scholar who still liked to mutter his Latin aloud, and the new-style reader who just wanted to devour their printed edition of Petrarch in blessed silence. Awkward. Excuse me, sir. Your Ciceronian rhetoric is rather drowning out my silent contemplation of Machiavelli's less than moral advice. Could you perhaps project your perfidy a little less? The demand for peaceful pages was undeniably growing, even if the supply of peaceful places lagged a bit behind. With so many more books available, covering an ever wider range of subjects, from religious tracts and classical philosophy to poetry, histories, and practical manuals on everything from herbal medicine to, well, probably how to be less annoying at family dinners now, that everyone could own a copy of The Art of War. Could you pass the turnips? Father. And perhaps you might consider Sun Tzu's teachings on flanking maneuvers as they apply to the last remaining dinner roll. The world of letters was expanding, and the primary way to navigate this expanding universe was increasingly through the silent, focused gaze of the individual reader. The printing press didn't come with a mute button for libraries, but it massively amplified the underlying cultural shifts that were making quiet not just a preference, but an emerging necessity for effective engagement with the burgeoning world of print. The first person to get a paper cut from a printed book, by the way, was probably deeply offended. Vellum never attacked me like this. This newfangled paper is clearly a menace. So, you've felt the tremors of Gutenberg's invention. The world is suddenly awash with printed books, relatively cheap, surprisingly accessible, and so much easier on the eyes than those quirky, hand-copied manuscripts. Remember how this explosion of print made personal, silent reading not just a niche skill for a few contemplative monks like Ambrose, but an increasingly common practice for anyone with a few shillings and a thirst for knowledge, or just the latest scandalous pamphlets. Well, this widespread adoption of private, silent reading started to create a new kind of pressure, a subtle but growing demand for spaces where one could actually do it without the world yammering in their ear. You find yourself now moving into the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th centuries. Libraries are evolving, while some might still have those charmingly archaic chained collections, especially for their most precious items, can't be too careful. Even with printed books, the trend is towards more open access, more books on more shelves. But this created a bit of a conundrum. If you have more people wanting to read, and these people are increasingly reading silently and individually, what happens when the library space itself is still a bit of a multi-purpose hub? What if the librarians are busy cataloging new acquisitions in the same room? Or scholars are having animated but still learned? Of course, discussions over by the theology section. The printing press made books peaceful on the page, but the library environment itself needed to catch up. Enter the dedicated reading room. This is a significant step. We're not just talking about a room that happens to contain books anymore. We're talking about a space designed from the ground up, or at least significantly refitted, for the primary activity of reading. You walk into one of these emerging spaces, perhaps in a grand new university library, a burgeoning public institution, or even a stately home with a serious collection. The first thing you might notice is the light. Architects are paying more attention to this. Tall windows, often strategically placed to maximize natural illumination without direct glaring sunlight on the precious pages, become a hallmark. You might see long, polished wooden tables, sometimes with individual, slightly partitioned desk spaces. The chairs are sturdy, perhaps not lazy-boy comfortable by modern standards, but designed for hours of seated contemplation. There's a feeling of order, of deliberate calm. The scent of aged paper and leather bookbindings is, of course, pervasive, but it's now mingling with the faint, clean smell of beeswax polish on the wood and the almost imperceptible but psychologically present aroma of focused human thought. A mainstream historical fact is that this period, particularly the 17th and 18th centuries, saw the construction of some truly magnificent, purpose-built library buildings and reading rooms that explicitly prioritized not just the storage of books, but the experience of the reader. Think of the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge, with its soaring windows and elegant proportions, or the iconic Radcliffe camera at Oxford. These weren't just warehouses for texts, they were designed as temples of learning, and their very architecture began to suggest a certain decorum, a certain hushed reverence. The design itself starts to whisper, quiet. High ceilings might not have been solely for aesthetic grandeur, they could also help dissipate sound, making individual coughs or the scrape of a chair less obtrusive. Walls might be lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, and the books themselves, packed tightly together, act as natural sound dampeners. There's a concerted effort, in many cases, to separate the noisier, more administrative functions of the library, the cataloging, the book processing, the animated discussions between librarians about whose turn it was to chase the mice out of the manuscript collection, from the serene sanctuary of the reading room itself. Jenkins, your enthusiastic hammering of the new acquisition stamp is disturbing the bishop's perusal of Plotinus. Take it to the scullery, man. The expectation of quiet in these dedicated spaces grows stronger, even if it isn't yet enforced with the almost mythical zeal of later librarians. It's more of an implicit understanding. The room's purpose is clear. This is where you come to engage deeply and personally with texts, loud conversations, boisterous laughter, or practicing your operatic scales, however divinely inspired, would feel increasingly out of place. A transgression against the unspoken code of the room. You know how some places just feel like you should lower your voice? These early reading rooms were beginning to cultivate exactly that aura. Of course, human nature being what it is, rules still had to be made. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some of these early reading rooms would have posted rather elaborate lists of regulations, covering all manner of potential disturbances. You'd find injunctions against bringing in food or drink, a perennial battle for librarians throughout history. It seems. No, Lord Harrington, you may not consume your mutton pie whilst consulting the Magna Carta. Crumbs, you know. There would be admonitions against loud and unseemly disputations, the marking or damaging of books, and sometimes even prohibitions against unnecessary perambulation or, heaven forbid, whistling, humming, or the beating of time with one's foot. One can almost picture a sternly worded notice. Rule 7th. Gentlemen shall refrain from dueling, either with swords or with particularly pointed rhetorical questions. Amongst the philosophy stacks, any challenges must be issued and accepted in the antechamber. And no, Sir Giles, he started it is not a valid defense if your epee skewers a priceless first folio. The librarian in one of these increasingly quiet reading rooms probably began to develop that very specific, highly effective "you are disturbing the sacred communion" between reader and text glare. It's a look that can stop a raconteur mid-anecdote at 50 paces. It doesn't require a single word, just a slight elevation of the eyebrows, a focused narrowing of the eyes, possibly delivered over the top of a pair of spectacles. Years to perfect that glare. Generations of librarians have since honed it to an art form. Historians still argue whether the specific architectural choices in these early dedicated reading rooms, such as the aforementioned high ceilings, the types of wood used for paneling and furniture, or the placement of alcoves, were consciously and primarily intended to manage acoustics and actively promote silence. Or if these features were driven more by prevailing aesthetic tastes, structural necessities, or solutions to other practical challenges like lighting and ventilation, with the quieter atmosphere being a fortunate, if welcome, byproduct. It's likely a mix, but the end result was spaces that felt more conducive to hushed activity. And as these spaces became quieter, the people within them adapted. You'd see readers developing an almost preternatural ability to turn a page without making a sound, a skill born of consideration for their fellow scholars. The ninja page turner? They probably called them in hushed whispers of admiration. Did you see Bartholomew? He just read an entire chapter of Bede, and I didn't hear a single rustle. The man's a legend. The dedicated reading room, then, was a crucial milestone. It was a physical, tangible acknowledgement that the act of reading, especially the silent, individual reading fostered by the printing press, deserved its own specially protected environment. The walls themselves, the very design of the space, began to internalize and project the message this is a place for quiet contemplation. The hush was starting to become part of the furniture. So, you've seen these lovely, dedicated reading rooms starting to emerge, these havens of nascent quiet like the Wren Library or the Radcliffe Camera, where the very architecture seems to encourage a lowering of the voice and a focusing of the mind. Remember that almost sacred atmosphere, the scent of polish and profound thought. It's a beautiful image. But now, let's just take a slight detour, a little architectural reality check, to understand what these new ideals of quiet were often up against. Because for a very long time, and in many of the grandest and most venerable library spaces, the buildings themselves were, shall we say, not exactly team players in the quest for silence. In fact, they were often unintentional amplifiers, turning the smallest sound into a public announcement. You need to picture the kind of halls we're talking about. Think of those magnificent, high-ceilinged spaces you often find in older universities, cathedrals which sometimes housed significant libraries, or the grand private libraries of nobles and wealthy scholars from the Renaissance through the early modern period. We're talking vaulted ceilings that soar stories above your head, sometimes culminating in ornate domes. The floors polished stone, marble, or sturdy oak planks, all wonderfully durable, but also wonderfully reflective of sound. The walls are often stone or hard plaster, perhaps adorned with intricate wooden paneling, but rarely with anything soft and sound-absorbent. Large, expansive windows, designed to let in as much precious light as possible in the pre-electric era, offer more hard, glassy surfaces for sound waves to bounce off. These are spaces designed to inspire awe, to speak of grandeur and the lofty nature of learning. Unfortunately, they also speak quite loudly of everything else happening within them. This is the cathedral effect in action. A mainstream historical fact is that many large historical buildings, particularly those with voluminous interiors and constructed from hard, reflective materials like stone and glass, cathedrals, palaces, and by extension, library halls designed in similar architectural styles naturally possess long reverberation times. This means that sounds, instead of being absorbed and dampened, bounce around the space, echoing and lingering, often being amplified in the process. A single dropped book could resonate with the drama of a minor explosion. A cough could echo from one end of the hall to the other, gathering gravitas as it went. Even a conspiratorial whisper, if uttered in just the wrong spot, might travel with uncanny clarity to an unintended listener several bays away. Did you hear that Bartholomew just implied that Dean's Latin prose is derivative scandalous? So, while the desire for quiet contemplation was growing, and more people were reading silently thanks to those ever-so-helpful Irish monks and Gutenberg's handy invention, remember, the very environment in many libraries was often working against this emerging preference. It's not that these places were intentionally designed to be noisy, far from it. The architects were focused on stability, durability, light, and, of course, aesthetics. Acoustic design for the purpose of creating a quiet atmosphere for individual study just wasn't high on the priority list. If it was on the list at all, the science of acoustics was still in its infancy. Imagine trying to concentrate on a complex philosophical treatise when every scrape of a chair, every rustle of a page from across the room, every scholarly sniffle performs an unsolicited concert around your ears. It would have required a particular kind of mental fortitude, an ability to filter out the ambient soundscape, or perhaps just a higher tolerance for what we might now consider distracting noise. Trying to have a discreet, hushed conversation in one of these acoustically lively halls would have been a masterclass in futility. Psst. 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 I think the new treatise on celestial mechanics? Celestial mechanics. Celestial mechanics is utterly flawed, utterly flawed, utterly flawed. Oh, brilliant. Now, the entire astronomy faculty thinks I'm a heretic. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. There are many anecdotal accounts from these older, grand libraries of specific whispering spots or echo corners. These were locations where, due to the particular geometry of the arches, vaults, or domes, sounds produced in one specific place would be focused and clearly audible in another, often quite distant, spot, while remaining inaudible to people in between. You can imagine students or scholars discovering these by accident, perhaps with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Don't confess your secret passion for alchemy near the statue of St. Jerome, lads. Professor Grimshaw over by the Chronicles can hear every word, and he really disapproves of turning lead into gold on university premises. These acoustic quirks would have added another layer of unpredictability to the library's soundscape. The librarians shh in such a reverberant hall, if they dared to employ it, must have been a truly formidable event. It wouldn't just be a quiet admonition, it would be a rolling wave of sibilance, echoing through the rafters, bouncing off the portraits of stern-faced founders, and possibly causing nervous first-year students to drop their very heavy, very loud books in fright, thereby exacerbating the problem. The very walls have shushed me, a student might whisper later, wide-eyed, and I think a gargoyle winked. Historians still argue whether patrons and scholars in these highly reverberant historical libraries simply adapted to the prevailing ambient sound levels and, out of necessity, developed a higher tolerance for what we'd now consider background noise, or if these inherent acoustic challenges actively and significantly spurred on the desire for and architectural development of smaller, more acoustically controlled reading spaces as building techniques and understanding evolved. Perhaps it was a bit of both. People may do, but the dream of a truly quiet study space became even more appealing when your current one sounded like the inside of a beautifully decorated drum. Modern libraries, of course, benefit from centuries of acoustic science. We have sound-absorbing panels, specially designed ceiling tiles, noise-dampening carpets, and layouts that minimize sound travel. Back then, if they were lucky, they might have had heavy tapestries hanging on some walls, which would have helped a bit by absorbing some of the higher frequencies. But they weren't a comprehensive solution for a booming echo in a stone vault. You drop your quill, and the clatter echoes for what feels like an eternity. Everyone turns to glare. You start to feel like the building itself is personally offended by your clumsiness. The Great Hall of Infinite Clangs records your every fumbling misstep. Reader, be warned. So, while the intellectual and social currents were gradually pulling libraries towards a quieter ideal, the very stone and timber of many existing library buildings were often pushing back, amplifying every little sound. The journey to achieving library hush wasn't just about changing human behavior and reading habits. It would also, eventually, involve learning how to design and modify physical spaces so they didn't fight so loudly against the pursuit of peaceful contemplation. The architecture itself needed to learn how to whisper. All right, so you've experienced the architectural acoustic nightmare that many older libraries presented. Remember those grand, echoing halls where a dropped pin sounded like a starter pistol for a philosophical debate, and a whisper could perform an unsolicited tour of the entire room? It's a wonder anyone got any silent reading done. You've got more people wanting to read silently, more dedicated reading rooms appearing that are supposed to be quiet, but the buildings themselves are often singing their own booming anthems. This is where the human element really has to step up to the plate. Or rather, step up to the shush. Because the idea of a quiet library doesn't just magically happen, it needs to be actively cultivated, sometimes against considerable odds. Enter the librarian, no longer just a curator of chained books or a dusty scholar cataloging acquisitions. You see them evolving into a new role, the guardian of the nascent quiet, the reluctant enforcer of a still fragile peace. It's one thing for a room to be designed for quiet contemplation, as you saw with those early reading rooms, but it's quite another to ensure that the diverse, sometimes distractible, and occasionally outright noisy human beings within it actually adhere to that ideal. So, how did they do it? What were these first, sometimes awkward, attempts to turn down the volume? Well, one of the earliest lines of defense was the written word itself. You'll recall those posted rules we talked about. No food, no dueling amongst the folios, Sir Giles. We're looking at you. These regulations increasingly began to include explicit mentions of noise. You might see a carefully lettered sign, perhaps in rather stern Latin or the vernacular of the day, requesting studious silence, or admonishing patrons to refrain from loud discourse, or to avoid causing disturbance to others. Of course, a sign is only as effective as people's willingness to read and obey it. Many probably saw it as more of a gentle suggestion, easily overlooked if the gossip was particularly juicy or the scholarly argument particularly heated. Oh, that Silentium, I thought it was the name of a particularly dull Roman emperor. When signs failed, as they inevitably often did, it fell to the librarian, or someone in authority, to intervene more directly. This is where you get the iconic shh, or its historical equivalents. It might have been a more formal, "Gentlemen, I must request a modicum of quietude," or perhaps just a pointed, significant cough, laden with disapproval. Imagine the sheer awkwardness for those early enforcers. In a world where reading aloud had been the norm for centuries, actively telling people to be quiet while they were engaging with books could feel unnatural, even a bit rude. The first librarian who managed to successfully shush an entire room of vociferously debating academics probably felt a mixture of terror and triumph. Like they'd just single-handedly faced down a charging rhino armed only with a well-placed sibilant. They likely went home that night and told their cat all about it. And then mittens. Then I said shh, and you won't believe what happened next. Nonverbal cues were, of course, a vital part of the arsenal. The glare TM, which you saw beginning to be perfected in those early reading rooms, became an essential tool. This wasn't just any glare, it was a carefully calibrated expression of sorrowful disappointment mixed with unwavering resolve. Capable of making even the most oblivious chatterbox suddenly aware of their sonic transgressions. A slow, deliberate turn of the head, the raising of an eyebrow, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the world's unread books. These were the subtle weapons in the battle for tranquility. Some librarians might have even employed a small handbell, not to start a boxing match, but to gain attention before making a general, and hopefully face-saving for all involved. Plea for a reduction in ambient noise. A mainstream historical fact is that library regulations concerning noise, along with other aspects of reader conduct, became increasingly common and far more specific from the 17th century onwards. This was especially true with the growth of university libraries and the first stirrings of what would become public libraries. These weren't just casual guidelines, they were conscious, documented efforts to shape the library into a space conducive to serious, focused study, an environment where the printed word could be absorbed without undue distraction. The social dynamics of shushing were complex. Who had the recognized authority to tell someone else to be quiet? A librarian could usually shush a student, but what about shushing a powerful nobleman, a wealthy patron of the library, or a highly respected and famously loud senior scholar that took guts? Your Grace? The librarian might begin, heart pounding like a printing press gone haywire. Whilst your anecdotal recollections of the Battle of Blenheim are undoubtedly fascinating, they are perhaps resonating a tad vigorously amongst the cartography collection. Then there was the risky business of patrons shushing other patrons. That could escalate quickly from a request for quiet into a full-blown, though hopefully still whispered argument about etiquette and personal liberty. Here's a quirky tidbit: some larger libraries, or those attached to wealthy households or institutions, might have employed sub-librarians, porters, or beadles, whose duties went beyond just fetching books. These individuals often had the explicit task of maintaining order and decorum, which definitely included noise control, and their methods might have been a bit more robust than a librarian's timid cough. Think of them as early library bouncers, ensuring that persistent offenders were dealt with firmly. Master Penhaligon, your daily rendition of bawdy sea shanties, while impressively comprehensive, is once again causing distress to those attempting to study ecclesiastical law. Might I suggest the tavern down the lane, or alternatively the street? Historians still argue whether the primary impetus for these stricter noise enforcement measures and the general drive towards a quieter library environment came predominantly from the librarians themselves, who might have desired a more orderly and manageable space and perhaps a bit of peace and quiet for their own work. Or if it was largely driven by the demands of a growing critical mass of library users, those proficient silent readers, who genuinely needed and actively agitated for quieter conditions to pursue their studies effectively. It was likely a push-pull dynamic, with both librarians and a significant portion of their patrons gradually aligning on the benefits of a more tranquil atmosphere. The journey of that simple shh is quite something. It's a tiny sound, yet it represents a major cultural shift, a point where the ideal of a quiet library was no longer just a passive aspiration, but an actively pursued, though often imperfectly achieved, goal. The guardians of the hush were finding their voice, or rather their strategically deployed lack thereof, armed with signs, glares, and the courage to confront the cacophony. And you thought your librarian was strict just because they charged you an overdue fine for that book you swore you returned? Imagine them trying to quiet down a room full of 18th century gentlemen loudly debating the Corn Laws. That's next-level librarianship. You've witnessed those brave librarians, armed with their glares, their strategically deployed coughs, and the occasional handbell, attempting to carve out pockets of tranquility amidst the echoing halls and the sometimes boisterous habits of readers. Remember Geoffrey, the librarian, steeling his nerves to shush a Duke, a true unsung hero of the Quiet Revolution. But why all this effort? Why did the shh? It has become such an important, if sometimes awkwardly wielded, tool. It wasn't just about tidiness or a librarian's personal preference for a peaceful afternoon. It was because the very nature of scholarship, of deep intellectual work, was increasingly demanding an environment where the mind could operate without a constant barrage of auditory interference. Silence was becoming a scholarly necessity, As you drift through the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries, the Age of Enlightenment, the rise of modern science, the flourishing of complex philosophical systems, the kind of thinking required of scholars was becoming ever more intricate. The sheer volume of information available, thanks to our friend the printing press still churning out books like there's no tomorrow, meant that synthesizing knowledge, conducting detailed research, and formulating original arguments required immense powers of concentration. You couldn't just skim the surface anymore. Not if you wanted to make a real contribution. You needed to go deep. Think about the tasks at hand. A scientist like Isaac Newton, pondering the laws of motion and universal gravitation, needed to hold incredibly complex mathematical and conceptual frameworks in his mind for extended periods. A philosopher like Immanuel Kant, meticulously dissecting the very structures of human reason, was engaged in a profoundly internal, intricate construction of thought. A historian poring over ancient manuscripts and contradictory chronicles, trying to piece together a coherent narrative of the past, required sustained, focused attention to detail. All of this deep study, this wrestling with complex ideas, is incredibly vulnerable to distraction. Imagine trying to formulate the fundamental laws of physics while, just outside your window, your neighbor is enthusiastically, if ineptly, learning to play the sackbut, and their pet goat is attempting to eat your experimental cabbages. Right, so for every action, there is an equal and opposite. Blyet, confound it. Newton's third law of motion is now hopelessly entangled with that goat's insatiable desire for brassicas. This is where the cognitive benefits of quiet really come into play, even if they weren't articulated in the precise terms of modern neuroscience back then. Your brain, when trying to perform complex tasks, has a limited amount of processing power, what we might call cognitive load. If a significant portion of that power is constantly being diverted to filter out irrelevant noises, the chatter from the next table, the clatter of footsteps on a stone floor, the aforementioned sackbut practice, there's simply less capacity available for the main task at hand. Interruptions, even minor ones, it can break a delicate chain of thought, forcing you to backtrack and painstakingly reconstruct your reasoning. It's like trying to build an incredibly elaborate house of cards in a breezy room. Comprehension suffers, retention of complex information diminishes, and the likelihood of making errors or overlooking crucial details increases. A mainstream historical fact is that prominent thinkers and scholars from the early modern period onwards, figures like John Locke, René Descartes, and later many Romantic poets and philosophers, increasingly wrote about and exemplified the importance of solitude, reflection, and quiet contemplation for genuine intellectual breakthroughs and deep understanding. Their correspondence and biographies often reveal a conscious seeking out of tranquil environments for their most serious work. Quiet wasn't just a pleasant ambiance, it was recognized as fertile ground for the cultivation of ideas. The image of the solitary scholar, lost in thought in a silent study, became an aspirational ideal. The luxury of finding or creating such a quiet space also became, in some ways, a marker of serious scholarly intent, and, let's be honest, often a marker of privilege. In a world that was, by and large, much noisier and less private than many of our modern environments, think bustling households, workshops, and marketplaces often cheek by jowl with living quarters. Securing a truly quiet room dedicated to study was not something everyone could achieve. It signified a commitment to the life of the mind. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some scholars developed quite elaborate personal systems and rituals to protect their precious concentration and minimize distractions, going far beyond simply finding a quiet room. They might designate very specific hours of the day for their deep work, often the very early morning before the rest of the household was stirring and the cacophony of daily life began. You hear of individuals who would only allow themselves minimal sustenance, or who would wear particular clothing, or arrange their desk in a precise way, all little rituals designed to create a mental fortress against the outside world and allow them to sink into that state of profound focus. Think of Newton again, so absorbed in his calculations that he famously forgot to eat his meals. That level of intense absorption thrives in and almost demands an absence of external stimuli. You can almost hear the instructions given to the household staff. His lordship is currently grappling with the infinitesimals. He is to be disturbed for absolutely nothing short of the second coming, or possibly if the house catches fire. And even then, ascertain the severity of the blaze first. Historians still argue whether the increasingly explicit linking of silence with genius or profound intellectual capability during this period was purely a pragmatic recognition of cognitive necessity for complex thought, or if it also subtly served as a social marker, a way to distinguish the serious, deeply contemplative scholar from more superficial or dilettantish thinkers in an ever more crowded and competitive intellectual field, perhaps by emphasizing the need for and their access to quiet, contemplative spaces. Scholars were also reinforcing their status and the perceived depth of their intellectual endeavors. Oh, you do your philosophizing in the coffee house amidst all that chatter? How quaint. However, require absolute silence and the faint scent of crumbling vellum to truly commune with the eternal verities. The point is, the demand for quiet in places of study like libraries wasn't just some arbitrary rule imposed by fussy librarians. It was an organic response to the evolving demands of scholarship itself. When you're trying to understand, say, Kant's critique of pure reason, you need all the help you can get. Attempting it in an environment with more than two distinct ambient sounds is a recipe for a headache of metaphysical proportions, possibly leading to a sudden urge to abandon philosophy altogether and take up something simple, like advanced theoretical interpretive dance. Silence, in this context, isn't just golden, it's a cognitive lifeline. We seek it today with noise-canceling headphones and white noise apps, all in an effort to achieve that mental clarity, that auditory peace which scholars of previous centuries recognized as essential for pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. The quiet library wasn't just becoming a preference, it was becoming an indispensable laboratory for the mind. So, you felt that deep, almost spiritual yearning for quiet, that scholarly necessity for silence to allow the cogs of profound thought to turn without grinding against the grit of distraction. Remember Newton and his apple, presumably falling in a blissfully quiet orchard, not one plagued by a neighbor's experimental opera. The intellectual world had increasingly decided that silence wasn't just golden. It was an essential ingredient for cooking up genius. But now, a new chapter unfolds. One that throws open the library doors to an unprecedented degree, bringing with it a fresh wave of opportunities. And, you guessed it, a whole new symphony of potential noise. You're entering the era of the public library. Imagine the scene, it's the mid to late 19th century, perhaps in a bustling industrial city in England or a rapidly growing town in America. Grand, often rather imposing, new buildings are being erected, funded by philanthropic fervor, hello, Andrew Carnegie and a burgeoning civic pride. These are libraries for the people. A mainstream historical fact is that the public library movement, gaining serious momentum during this period, was driven by a powerful democratic ideal that knowledge, education, and the opportunity for self-improvement through books should be freely available to all citizens, regardless of their social standing or wealth. A truly noble ambition, one that would change countless lives, but also an ambition that would inevitably complicate the now deeply ingrained association of libraries with hushed reverence. You step inside one of these new public libraries. The scale might be impressive. High ceilings, long corridors, vast reading rooms filled with rows of tables. But the clientele is noticeably different from the exclusive scholarly enclaves or monastic scriptoria you've visited. Here you see working-class men and women, perhaps seeking to educate themselves after a long day in the factory. You see clerks and shop assistants, eager to borrow the latest novels or popular histories. And crucially, you see children, sometimes in droves, wide-eyed, curious, and not always naturally inclined to monastic silence. The very air buzzes with a different kind of energy. It's the sound of aspiration, of discovery, of a community engaging with ideas. But it's not always quiet. The architectural grandeur of many of these Victorian public libraries, while inspiring, could also be a bit of an acoustic throwback. Remember those echoing ancient halls we discussed? Well, some of these new temples of popular learning, with their lofty ceilings, tiled floors, and vast open spaces, could unintentionally create similar conditions, where every dropped book or scraped chair seemed to announce itself to the entire building. Herein lies the new tension. On one hand, you have the established ideal of the library as a sanctuary for quiet, focused study, an ideal hard-won through centuries of evolving reading habits and scholarly needs. On the other hand, you have this vibrant new institution, the public library, whose very mission is to be accessible, welcoming, and actively used by a broad and diverse populace, many of whom might not be steeped in the traditions of scholarly quietude. What happens when someone wants to silently parse a complex philosophical text just a few tables away from a group of children, excitedly discovering the joys of a picture book? Perhaps with accompanying and enthusiastic animal noises. Ba moo! Now what was that about Kant's categorical imperative again? This influx of new users and new uses brought fresh challenges to the maintenance of quiet. Children, bless their inquisitive hearts, are naturally more prone to exuberance and less inhibited by unspoken rules of silence. The development of separate children's rooms or designated children's sections within libraries, which became increasingly common, wasn't just about providing age-appropriate materials, it was also a pragmatic noise management strategy. Keep the joyful squeals and enthusiastic storytime participation contained, so the adults trying to read about the Napoleonic Wars in peace don't feel like they're actually in one of the battles. Furthermore, not everyone using the public library was there for silent, deep scholarly immersion. People came to read newspapers, often a surprisingly noisy affair with much rustling and muttered commentary on the day's events, to browse illustrated magazines, to consult directories, or even, in some cases, just to find a warm, dry place to sit for a while. These are all perfectly legitimate uses of a public space, but they don't always align with the needs of someone trying to achieve a state of profound intellectual concentration. The sheer number of people passing through a busy public library also naturally increased the baseline level of ambient sound. More footsteps, more coughs, more whispered and not-so-whispered conversations. Librarians in these new public institutions found themselves performing a delicate balancing act. They were champions of popular education and access, but they were also the inheritors of that tradition of library quiet. And sometimes, the rules they had to devise to try and manage the sound levels could be quite specific. And from our modern perspective, occasionally rather amusing. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Browse through early public library rulebooks can unearth some wonderfully particular prohibitions. You might find rules against the cracking of nuts, a surprisingly common complaint. It seems loud or boisterous sneezing or coughing. Or even detailed instructions on the appropriate subdued volume for consulting a map or illustration with a companion. Rule 23, patrons expressing outrage or delight at the latest political cartoons in the periodical room shall endeavor to confine their exclamations of harumph or gadzooks to a level that does not cause the gas lamps to vibrate sympathetically. Historians still argue whether the initial architectural designs of many of these grand 19th century public libraries adequately anticipated the potential noise challenges that would be posed by opening their doors to a much broader public. Or if the primary emphasis in their construction was more on symbolic grandeur, efficient storage for rapidly growing collections, and accommodating large numbers of people, with acoustic control being a somewhat secondary concern that had to be addressed later through regulations. Internal modifications and the strategic deployment of stern-looking librarians. The librarians themselves deserved medals, really. One moment they might be patiently explaining the Dewey Decimal System to a bewildered new reader. The next they could be tactfully suggesting to a group of over-enthusiastic youths that the reference section wasn't the ideal spot for planning their next great adventure in kite flying. Master Timothy, while your innovative design for a self-propelled helium-assisted man-carrying kite is truly inspired, perhaps the engineering diagrams could be discussed at a slightly lower decibel level. The gentleman attempting to understand Plato is starting to look a little frayed. The quiet zone sign, if it existed in these early, bustling public libraries, might have felt like the most optimistic, and perhaps most frequently ignored. Piece of fiction in the entire building. So, the public library, a magnificent engine of social progress and individual betterment, introduced a whole new set of variables into the long-running equation of library quiet. The ideal of silence, once primarily the concern of scholars and monks, now had to negotiate its place within a much more democratic, diverse, and dynamic institution. The quest for hush was about to get a lot more public. So, you've navigated the grand, sometimes echoing halls of those new public libraries. Remember the scene. A democratic flood of new readers, children discovering picture books, working folks seeking knowledge after a long day, newspaper enthusiasts harumphing over the latest headlines. It was a glorious, if occasionally cacophonous, expansion of access to the written word. The librarians, those unsung heroes, were doing their best with posted rules and the occasional brave shh to manage the varied soundscape. But formal rules and librarian interventions can only go so far. For quiet to truly take root in these bustling new communal spaces, something else had to evolve library etiquette, the often unwritten, unspoken laws of hushed behavior. This is where the power of social norms and subtle peer pressure really begins to shine. Imagine yourself as a first-time visitor to one of these impressive public libraries in, say, the late 19th or early 20th century. You might be a little awestruck by the sheer volume of books, the grand architecture, the earnest faces bent over pages. You walk in, perhaps chatting a little too loudly with your companion, or letting the heavy door slam behind you. And then you notice it. Not necessarily a librarian rushing over to scold you, but perhaps a series of subtle cues from the other patrons. A few heads might turn, not aggressively, but with a certain questioning look. Someone further down the long reading table might emit a soft, yet distinctly pointed sigh, a sigh that seems to carry the weight of 1,000 disturbed thoughts. You might see others moving with a deliberate quietness, handling books gently, speaking in hushed whispers if they speak at all. This is how etiquette often works. Through observation and a kind of social osmosis, new users, keen to fit in or simply respectful of what appears to be the established custom, start to mimic the behavior of the more seasoned, serious readers. They learn by watching. They notice the subtle, almost invisible dance of consideration that allows many people to share a space for the purpose of quiet contemplation. A mainstream historical fact is that the latter half of the 19th and the early 20th centuries saw a significant emphasis on the development and codification of social etiquette for various public spaces. From parks and museums to newly accessible institutions like libraries, this was often tied to Victorian and Edwardian ideals of respectability, self-improvement, and demonstrating considerate public behavior as a marker of good citizenship. What did this evolving, often unwritten, library law entail? Well, it covered a multitude of small behaviors that, collectively, contribute to a quieter atmosphere. There was the art of the minimized conversation if you absolutely had to speak. You kept it brief, to the point, and in a low whisper that wouldn't carry. There was the careful handling of materials, turning pages softly, placing books down gently rather than thudding them onto the table, easing chairs in and out instead of scraping them across the floor. You'd avoid making unnecessary trips back and forth, or rustling through your belongings with excessive vigor. There was also an unstated understanding about not hogging resources or sprawling across a table in a way that was distracting or inconsiderate to others. And pervading it all was a general aura of serious purpose. Even if you were just browse a light novel, you did so with an air that respected the fact that the person next to you might be wrestling with Darwin or deciphering Sanskrit. The architecture itself, as we've discussed, could play a role in reinforcing this etiquette. A grand, high-ceilinged reading room, filled with the quiet industry of dozens of focused individuals, naturally feels like a place where one should behave with a certain decorum. The physical environment can subtly prompt a more subdued demeanor. It's like walking into a cathedral. You instinctively lower your voice, not because there's a sign every 5 feet telling you to, but because the space itself commands a certain reverence. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. It's highly probable that popular etiquette manuals or advice columns in ladies' magazines and household guides of the late 19th and early 20th centuries would have included specific sections on how to conduct oneself in a public library, alongside tips on how to host a successful tea party or the correct way to use a calling card. You might find advice on appropriate library attire nothing too flamboyant or rustly. My dear, admonitions against eating pungent snacks amongst the periodicals, and, of course, gentle reminders about maintaining a studious and becoming quiet. A true lady, one such imaginary guide might instruct, ensures that the rustle of her taffeta petticoats does not unduly disturb the gentleman attempting to parse Adam Smith next to her. Furthermore, exclamations of delight upon discovering a particularly romantic passage in a novel should be confined to a silent, gratified smile, not an audible gasp that might startle the nearby geologist examining strata maps. The passive-aggressive sigh, perfected by generations of library patrons whose concentration had been rudely shattered by a novice's overly enthusiastic newspaper unfolding technique, became an art form. That sigh wasn't just a release of breath. It was a complex social signal, a nonverbal dissertation on the importance of library decorum, a poignant lament for a lost train of thought, and a gentle but firm reminder to do better. It was a masterpiece of understated communication. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption and internalization of this quiet library etiquette by the general public was more a result of genuine empathetic respect for the cognitive needs of fellow readers and a shared understanding of the library's purpose, or if it was, to a significant extent, a form of social conformity, a desire to appear respectable, educated, and well-mannered in a public setting where one was, in a sense, on display. Perhaps it was a blend of both a genuine desire not to disturb, amplified by the social expectation that cultured people behaved quietly in such esteemed institutions. Imagine the internal monologue of someone diligently trying to adhere to these unwritten rules. Right? Entry accomplished with minimal door creak. Book selected from shelf with ninja-like silence. Chair maneuvered into position with the stealth of a woodland creature. Now to open said book. Page by page, without a single crackle, and to think profound thoughts, but not so profound that my furrowed brow makes a distracting spectacle. It could be quite a performance. And woe betide the person who coughed too many times, or, heaven forbid, had a squeaky pair of new shoes. The collective silent judgment could be palpable. These unspoken rules, this shared understanding of considerate behavior, played an absolutely crucial role in taming the potential chaos of the newly democratized library space. It was the internalization of the shh, where the responsibility for maintaining a conducive atmosphere began to shift, at least partially, from the librarian alone to the community of readers themselves. The library was becoming not just a place of rules, but a place of widely accepted custom. You've seen how the unwritten rules of library etiquette, those subtle sighs and pointed glances, began to weave a culture of quiet into the fabric of public libraries. Remember the lady with the rustling taffeta petticoats being gently or not so gently reminded of her sonic impact? It's a fascinating dance of social learning. But even with the best intentions and a generally observant populace, a large reading room, shared by dozens or even hundreds of individuals, will always have a certain level of ambient hum. The gentle rustle of a turned page, the distant scrape of a chair, a stifled cough, these tiny sounds, multiplied, can still create a subtle tapestry of distraction for someone trying to achieve truly deep, unbroken concentration. For those moments when you really need to wrestle with a complex idea in splendid isolation, something more was needed. Enter the study corral, the cubicle of quiet, the personal nook of profound thought. You might recall a fleeting mention of early corrals in monastic cloisters or medieval university libraries, often little niches built into window recesses, offering a bit of seclusion for a monk copying a manuscript or a scholar poring over a text. Now, as you move further into the 20th century, you see this concept refined and deliberately implemented as a specific architectural solution within larger libraries, especially academic and research institutions. The corral becomes a purpose-built sanctuary for the individual mind. Picture yourself approaching one. It's essentially a small, semi-enclosed desk, a little alcove of study. It might have high partitions on three sides, creating a distinct visual barrier from the rest of the room. Sometimes they are arranged in rows, sometimes tucked into quieter corners of the stacks. The space is intimate, designed for one. You slide into the chair, and the world outside seems to recede a little. Your view is immediately focused the surface of the desk, perhaps a small shelf for a few essential books, the wall directly in front of you. Maybe there's a dedicated task light, casting a focused beam onto your work, creating a little pool of illumination in your personal haven. The sounds of the larger library, the distant footsteps, the hum of the ventilation, are noticeably muted, dampened by the carrel's enclosing structure. It's not soundproof, usually, but it offers a significant reduction in both auditory and visual distractions. The purpose of these little fortresses of solitude is clear. They are designed to create a personal territory for prolonged, intensive study. They cater to the student writing a dissertation, the researcher meticulously analyzing data, the scholar drafting a complex argument. In a carrel, you can spread out your notes, surround yourself with your key texts, and immerse yourself in your work with a greater sense of privacy and focus than is often possible at a large, open reading table. A mainstream historical fact is that study carrels became an increasingly common and valued feature in academic and research libraries throughout the 20th century. Specifically engineered to provide these individual, secluded spaces, essential for the kind of deep intellectual labor that underpins scholarly production. There's a certain psychology to the carrel, a cocoon effect, if you will. The physical enclosure seems to help create a mental enclosure. By limiting external stimuli, it allows the mind to turn inward, to grapple more effectively with abstract concepts or intricate details without being constantly pulled back to the surface by the movements and sounds of others. It's like giving your brain its own little private room to think in. For many, the corral isn't just a piece of furniture, it's an essential tool for concentration, a facilitator of flow. The corral where you can finally achieve that perfect zen of scholarly hermitude, interrupted only by the occasional profound insight, the urgent need for another cup of coffee, or perhaps a mild panic attack about your impending deadline. It's your tiny isolation chamber, but with better access to footnotes and fewer concerns about sensory deprivation. Usually, here's a quirky tidbit for you: these carrels, intended for focused, often solitary work, frequently become strangely personalized by their long-term occupants. Especially in university libraries where a student or faculty member might be assigned one for an extended period. You'd see little touches that transform the anonymous cubicle into a temporary intellectual home. A carefully curated stack of reference books always in the same order, a favorite, perfectly weighted pen, perhaps a discreetly placed photograph or an inspirational quote taped to the inside of a partition, strictly against the rules in some places. Of course, but academic rebellion has to start somewhere. You might even find a very small, very quiet, and technically forbidden, potted succulent adding a touch of green. Professor Armitage has been in corral number 12 down in the archives for so long. It's rumored the spiders there have PhDs in his field and occasionally offer, unsolicited, but surprisingly insightful, critiques of his chapter drafts. The unspoken territorial dynamics around desirable carrels could also be quite intense, in a very subdued, library-appropriate way. The carrels by the window with the nice view but not too much distracting bird activity, or the ones tucked away in the quietest, most remote corner of the building. often became highly coveted. It was a silent, passive-aggressive battle waged with strategically timed arrivals. The pointed leaving of a single significant-looking book to reserve a spot and the occasional frosty glare exchange between rival claimants. It's like a very polite, very hushed version of musical chairs, but with higher intellectual stakes and a much slower tempo. Historians still argue whether the significant proliferation of individual study corrals in libraries during the 20th century was primarily a direct response to overwhelming user demand for enhanced privacy and deeper silence for their work, or if it also reflected broader shifts in pedagogical approaches and research methodologies that increasingly emphasized individualized learning, solitary scholarly production, and long-term, project-based work. It's likely a confluence of factors as scholarly tasks became more specialized and demanding of prolonged individual focus, and as library users became more accustomed to seeking out optimal conditions for concentration. The carrel emerged as a perfect architectural and functional solution. You know you've spent a significant amount of your life in a library carrel when you start referring to it as the office, and instinctively reach for your non-existent intercom button to ask your non-existent secretary to hold all your calls. Or perhaps when you've developed a complex, entirely one-sided relationship with the person who regularly occupies the carrel next to yours, based entirely on the sounds of their page-turning and occasional deeply scholarly sighs. Agnes from Carrel B7 is clearly struggling with Foucault again today. I recognize that particular sigh of existential despair. The carrel, in its simple, functional design, represents a profound acknowledgement by the library as an institution, an understanding that deep thought often requires a retreat from the communal, a dedicated space where the individual mind can engage with complex material, undisturbed and undistracted. It's the library saying, "We understand. You need to be alone with these ideas, these texts, these calculations. Here is your personal quiet box. Go forth and concentrate." You've found your way into those havens of personal quiet, the study carrels, those little cubicles of concentration where scholars could finally escape the last vestiges of ambient noise and truly commune with their texts. Remember Professor Armitage and his tenured dust bunnies in Carrel 7 co-authoring profound thoughts. It's a testament to the deep human need for focused, undisturbed thought. And so, after this long, meandering journey, from the boisterous oral readings over clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, through the murmuring monastic scriptoria, past the clanking chains of medieval collections, into the revolutionary silence of individual reading spurred by print, navigating the bustling new public libraries, and finally settling into the deep calm of a personal study nook. You arrive at the library as many of us know it today, and one of its most defining, most cherished characteristics is that gentle, pervasive hush. But why in our incredibly noisy, hyper-connected, digitally saturated 21st century world, where information screams at us from a dozen screens at once? Why does this tradition of library quiet not only endure but often feel more precious than ever? You'd think it might have become an outdated relic, a quaint custom from a slower, more contemplative era. Yet, walk into almost any library, anywhere in the world, and you'll likely find those designated quiet zones, those silent study areas, fiercely protected and deeply appreciated. The most straightforward reason, of course, is that the fundamental need for concentration hasn't changed. Whether you're a student cramming for exams, a researcher delving into complex data, a writer trying to craft the perfect sentence, or simply someone wanting to lose themselves in a good story, the ability to focus your mind without constant interruption is paramount. Deep reading, critical thinking, creative work. All these activities flourish in an environment where the auditory clutter of the outside world is minimized. The library, in many ways, remains one of the last public bastions dedicated to this kind of mental sanctuary. It's a place where you can go to escape the cacophony, to allow your thoughts to unfurl and connect in peace. There's also a profound psychological comfort associated with library quiet. For many, that gentle hush is not an oppressive silence, but a soothing balm. It signals a space dedicated to learning, to introspection, to the calm exploration of ideas. The very atmosphere can be conducive to a more relaxed, yet focused state of mind. It's the aura of the library, a feeling built up over centuries, that this is a place where the mind can breathe. A mainstream historical fact is that even as modern libraries have brilliantly evolved to incorporate more collaborative spaces, community programs, maker labs, and digital hubs, they almost universally continue to provide and protect clearly demarcated quiet zones or silent study areas. This isn't just an afterthought, it's a direct acknowledgement of a persistent and deeply felt user demand for such environments. The modern library, then, is often engaged in a skillful balancing act. It strives to be a vibrant community center, open and welcoming to all, offering a multitude of services that sometimes involve a certain level of lively interaction. Yet, it also remains committed to its traditional role as a haven for quiet contemplation and focused study. You'll often find libraries with different zones, each with its own accepted sound level. A bustling children's area here, a collaborative workroom there, and, inevitably, that serene, silent reading room, or a floor dedicated to hushed individual work. The shh is still present, but it's become more nuanced, more about respecting the designated purpose of a particular space rather than a blanket edict over the entire building. Here's a quirky tidbit for you, though it's probably something you've experienced yourself. Consider the almost Pavlovian response many people exhibit when they walk into a library. Even if there isn't a prominent "Quiet Please" sign at the entrance, even if they haven't been explicitly shushed by a librarian in years, there's an automatic tendency to lower one's voice, to tread more softly, to move with a greater sense of deliberation. It's as if we all carry a tiny, ancestral librarian within our subconscious, perpetually poised with a spectral finger to its lips, ready to remind us of the expected decorum. This deeply ingrained cultural conditioning speaks volumes about how powerful and enduring the association between libraries and quiet has become. Sociologists and library scientists still argue whether the enduring appeal of library quiet in our current digital age is primarily driven by a nostalgic attachment to traditional scholarly environments and the comforting familiarity of an established norm, or if it's rooted in a genuine, ongoing, cognitive and psychological need for offline public spaces that actively facilitate deep focus and provide a refuge from the relentless digital interruptions of modern life. It's likely a rich blend of both, the comfort of tradition meeting a very real contemporary need. The modern librarian, of course, Aki still has their work cut out for them. Navigating these varied expectations? Imagine gently trying to explain to a group of enthusiastic teenagers why their impromptu, full-volume karaoke session, inspired by a musical biography they just found, might not be perfectly suited for the designated silent research zone. Your rendition of Hamilton, while spirited and showing great promise, is perhaps causing some chronological confusion for the Civil War historian in Corel 3. Might I suggest the amphitheater down the street? Or perhaps just mouthing the words with really intense feeling? You know, the library hush still holds a certain power when even your smartphone, sensing the sacred atmosphere or perhaps just your own ingrained habits, seems to almost instinctively vibrate itself into silent mode upon crossing the threshold. Fearing the collective, icy glare from the occupants of the silent zone, should it dare to emit an unseemly notification ding. And the ultimate modern test of library hush. Trying to eat a particularly crisp apple or a crinkly bag of chips in the silent reading room. Every bite, every rustle reverberates through the stillness like a thunderclap in a monastery. You start to develop advanced, almost comically stealthy, consumption techniques, your jaw moving with the slow, deliberate precision of a bomb disposal expert. It's a high-stakes game of snack-based espionage, played out under the imagined or sometimes very real scrutiny of your fellow quiet seekers. So, this comforting, necessary tradition of library hush, born from a surprisingly noisy and complicated history, persists. It's a legacy woven from the practical needs of ancient scribes, the contemplative practices of monks, the revolutionary shift to silent reading, The security measures of chained books, the evolving demands of scholarly concentration, the civilizing influence of social etiquette, and the deliberate design of our shared spaces. It stands as a quiet testament to our enduring human need for places where we can simply think, where our minds can wander freely among the stacks of accumulated wisdom, and connect with the vast world of ideas, one peaceful, undisturbed page at a time. Word count 1100. And so, as our journey through the surprisingly noisy, then gradually hushed, halls of history comes to a gentle close, you feel the echoes of those ancient voices begin to fade, replaced by the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of a silently turned page. The clatter of the printing press recedes. The fervent debates of medieval scholars soften into a distant murmur, and even the most enthusiastic librarian's shh dissolves into the quiet air around you. You're left with a sense of peace, a comforting stillness that libraries have painstakingly cultivated over centuries. It's a quiet born not of emptiness, but of fullness. A space filled with the unspoken thoughts of countless readers, the silent wisdom held within infinite pages, and the shared understanding that sometimes the most profound connections are made in the absence of sound. Let the gentle quiet of this long story envelop you now. Let your mind drift, as easily as a feather floating down in a silent, sunlit reading room. There are no more facts to learn tonight, no more historical debates to ponder, only the soothing cadence of a story told, and the soft invitation to rest. The library of your mind is now closing for the night, its treasures safely stored, ready for new explorations when morning comes. Until then, allow the quiet to be your comfort, your companion, as you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep.